Okay, we're here. Now we're going to do angles. Okay, so there's, again, a bunch of terms. Remember, the terms are the key points. Once you have terms, you can work and understand things. So first one, well, so you've heard this one before, but we want to make sure we're clearly defining them. Angle, its definition is a figure formed by two rays with the same endpoint. That's your flashcard. Okay, so on the front side, again, we'll write the word angle, and then this goes on the back side, and then you also need an illustration on the back side. Now, this is your illustration. It says a figure formed by two rays with the same endpoint. So I need two rays. This is a ray. You got ray YX, and you have a second ray with the same endpoint, ray YZ. You put these two things together, and as long as it has the same endpoint, remember rays only have one endpoint, you have an angle. Okay, now there's a plethora of ways to name angles, and we have to be real careful. The easiest one, and most commonly misused, is to call this angle Y. This is okay to call this one angle Y because there's only one angle at this vertex. Again, we'll get to the definition of the vertex down at the bottom, and actually they're here. Here's a vertex, and the vertex is, in this case, Y. You can put those also on the same flashcard if that's beneficial. Put this whole thing here on, this whole thing on your flashcard. But right now we're just talking about the vertex. The vertex is Y. And that's because it's the point, the common endpoint. Now we can use this term. It's not the best way to do that. Another way to name an angle, and the most appropriate, is to go angle. And now what we're going to do is we're going to put it in an order. Now we have to have this, you have to have your vertex in the middle. So I can write X, Y, Z. So X, Y, Z. You have to trace it to get it. And then the other way to name the same exact angle is to go the opposite direction. But again, notice that the vertex is in the middle. So Z, Y, X. Z, Y, X. Now there is one more way to name an angle, and it's not illustrated here. I can put a number inside the angle right there in the interior of the angle. Now I can also label that one as angle 1. But here in this illustration didn't have one, but you can put the one there, and then you can also identify it as this. So there's actually four ways. Again, the four ways were you can name it just by the vertex. You can name it, the most appropriate way is to name it using three letters that trace through, so X, Y, Z, or you can do Z, Y, X, or the last one is just by a number if the number is indicated inside. So there's multiple ways to do that. Next term. Again, we're going to do the practice stuff in class. Highlight, measure of an angle. Now, if we're just to measure an angle, there's a couple of ways to do this. We have what's called a protractor. We also have this thing called a clinometer, which we may be using sometime at the point in the year, which is actually an easy way to approximate an angle measure for us. But what's important here is the terminology that we use. So a measure of an angle is a degree of an angle. And the way we write it is this way. If I'm to read this piece right here, the letter M stands for measure, angle, X, Y, Z. So on your flashcard, please make sure you write down to find the measure of degrees as in angles. Okay, we can use a protractor. And by the way, angles are always measured in a positive way. We say the absolute value, meaning that it has to be positive. But this also needs to be on your flashcard. This is the illustration of the word measure of angle. Measure angle X, Y, Z. Okay. Now again, we'll show you how to use a protractor. Um, and it may or may not be so significant or important to us. Some of this notation, especially here, looks a little weird, but I'll go through that in class. Now, when we measure angles, there's just certain types that we may get into later as well, but we're just going to go ahead and flashcard them. An acute angle has to be an angle between 0 and 90. I wouldn't necessarily write what's here. I probably would write the words acute on the other side, backside, a measure of an angle between 0 and 90. An obtuse angle is one that's between 90 and 180. And the next one you're probably most familiar with. A right angle has to equal 90. And a straight angle is really a line, okay, because it has 180 degrees. Just so you know what that looks like, if measure of angle AOB is 180, then you've got a center or you've got a vertex of 0, and you've got one direction is A. The opposite ray, remember we had that term before, is B. So ray 0 OB and ray OA are opposites. If you have this, we can call those opposite rays. We can also call that a straight angle, and we can also call that a line. We can call that line BA, all of which is, when we're doing measurement, will give us a measure of 180. On the next side, we have another rule or postulate. Again, these are go on your flashcard. Angle addition postulate. Definition. If a point lies in the interior of x0, the angle XOZ, then the measure of angle XOY plus the measure of angle YOZ equals the measure of XOZ. A lot of letters. Okay, so let's go to the illustration. Again, this needs to be on the backside too. Basically, if I take angle XOY, let's say that has a measure of 70 degrees. And I have a common ray that's shared between both angles, Y0, YOZ, and say that measure is 30 degrees. This postulate says I can take the measure of angle XOY, which is 70 degrees, add the measure of Y0, YOZ, which is 30 degrees, to get the measure of the whole angle, which is 100 degrees. And we'll be doing a lot of that, but keep in mind, look at the example. We're going to be using letters, and we're going to be able to add like terms, combine like terms, and solve. So again, we practiced that before, and that's a skill set that we need. So knowing the terms is important. The ability to write this kind of stuff is important. Notice they all have the common vertex, and they share common sides. That's where we're going to be allowed to add them all together. Next term, another flashcard, congruent angle. A congruent angle are two angles with equal measure. There's not much else to do there except for this, just to give you an illustration. If this is angle 5, it's 40 degrees, and they're congruent, then angle 6 has to be 40 degrees. So they may use the word congruent. That's just telling you they have exactly the same size. No matter whether it's a number or a letter, they're the same. A bisector. Well, if you have, in this case, in this picture here, this illustration right here, if we have two congruent angles. There must be a bisector of that angle. Okay, I'm highlighting. I should be highlighting because they're flashcards. There's a flashcard. The ray that divides the angle into two congruent angles. Okay, that's what an angle bisector is. So our bisector here is QR, I should say that correctly, ray QR. Okay, and we say that QR bisects this angle. Now, there's other ways to write it. If because it bisects, that implies or means that angle 5 and 6 have to be the same or are congruent, or we can say the measures are equal. Two ways to say the same exact thing. Next one, I've already kind of used the word adjacent. I haven't defined it yet. Adjacent angles are coplanar angles. That means they fall in the same plane. They have a common vertex and a common side, but no common interior points are called adjacent angles. So short of it all is it has these two angles, angle 1 and 2, are coplanar. They're both on the same plane. In other words, they're on the flat sheet of paper here. They're not coming out of the board. Okay. We have a common vertex, a common side, and notice the interiors, the insides of both of these don't have any common points. Okay. So we would say that in this particular case, in this particular picture here, that angle 1 is adjacent to angle 2. Okay, it's just a term that we use. Again, we're going to practice using those terms here. Okay, end of the lesson. Again, tomorrow we'll review those and make sure you share with your partner. And then we're also going to go through these practice questions before we get into any series questions.